Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar. We'll get started here in just a few moments. We'd like to know where you are either viewing or listening from today. I'm coming to you live from very chilly Connecticut. Hopefully it'll start warming up soon with spring right around the corner. So welcome everybody. Welcome from North Carolina, from New York, my next door neighbor. Hope everyone is having a wonderful Wednesday so far. Hello and welcome. Sunny but cold LA, California, New York. Hello and welcome. Virginia, it's probably warmer down there too. From the Bay Area, Utah, sunny Florida, Boston, Chicago. Welcome everybody. With that, we can go ahead and get started. So again, my name is Haley and I will be your host as we discuss today's topic. It's going to be benefits of automation and open source intake discovery. This is brought to you by OpenText and hosted by VIB. Today's webinar will be about 45 minutes long. We'll save the last 15 minutes or so for Q&A. We ask that you use that Q&A button to ask any and all questions. We'll do our best to answer those questions at the end of the presentation. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today, Tim and Mons. Tim is a product marketing manager with Debricked by OpenText, and Mons is a product manager with Debricked by OpenText. All right, take it away.
All right. So hello. So yes, as introduced, my name is Tim, and I'm also here with Mons, and we come from originally from startup Debricked that was then acquired by Micro Focus, and then Micro Focus got acquired into OpenText. So now we're part of that, but. Debricked, a little bit about Debricked is that we were originally a research project started at Lund University that then evolved into the company that we know now as Debricked. And it's always been about making open source easier for companies to use securely. And that is also the theme of today's presentation. So yeah, let's talk a bit about that. What do we do? So software composition analysis is something we've been doing for a long time. Our flavor of software composition analysis has emphasis on machine learning to deliver great accuracy, minimal false positives, and giving companies the tools to shift left. This has also been extended with the Debricked CLI for companies that need custom solutions. But last month, we launched Open Source Select with the vision of not just shifting left, but actually starting left. This product focuses more on the process of selecting components during intake. And we're going to dive a lot deeper into that during this presentation. So a lot of companies use open source. Your company probably uses open source and probably a lot of open source. Almost 80% of companies use open source in some way, shape, or form. And this has been on the rise for many, many years. And it's a natural part of software development now, and often makes up more than 80% of certain code bases. So with open source being such an enormous part of modern software development, and due to its inherent complexity, it's easy to see why it's becoming one of the most important areas to secure. So we commissioned a survey by Forrester Consulting to look into this, to look into problems relating to open source use amongst other enterprise clients, and trying to see like what are the issues and how do we meet them, because we've suspected for a long time that there has been a problem relating to intake, since with the knowledge we have from our SEA time, we know that a lot of people want to catch things earlier, doesn't catch things early enough, like compliance, and there's also big communication issues between like how do you communicate corporate policy and like all of these policies to developers that sit and do the intake. So we also wanted to understand the market fit for Open Source Select, which I will talk more about later. So let's start off with a quick poll that you should be seeing popping up on your screens right about now, I think. So what open source related challenges are your organization currently facing? And you can choose multiple options here, and you can even click on the little all of the above. But we want to know and see like what are the biggest things holding you back. So take a few seconds to answer that. All right. I think we're about done there. So, all right. So we can see here that 42% of everyone attending here has all of these problems. So it's managing open source vulnerabilities, it's managing open source licenses, managing open source intake at scale, and 36% managing open source vulnerabilities. So that's really interesting. And we're actually going to get into some of the statistics here on the demographics of the survey and also some of the findings that we have found. And yeah, so let's move on. Thank you for responding. So the demographics for the survey made by Forrester Consulting is we got 300 plus respondents, and it's all from different fields, different regions. There's lots of different roles that participated. So it's a big split between, it's almost a 50-50 split between America and Europe. There's a big split between full-time developers, managers, directors. So it's very representative. And it's not just software companies, it's healthcare companies, it's financial institutions. So it's very broad. And most of the respondents work for companies with over 5,000 people. So it's definitely enterprise people here that have been interviewed. So that gives you a bit of a basis on all the findings, where these findings have been made. And so if you recognize yourself in one of these, then you're probably also pretty close at home here. So let's see here. So diving into the study here, I think Mons here is going to take over, and you can introduce yourself and take it away.
All right, thanks a lot. So I'm Mons, product manager in the Bricks. Very nice to see 180 something people here. I have a background in software engineering, software architecture, software license compliance management, now for the past couple of years, software composition analysis, product management. So when we started to dive into the study, one of the things that we wanted to understand primarily, like Tim mentioned earlier, was how larger enterprises rank various criteria during selection, creation, and intake of open source. So the first result or data point that we want to discuss here is these criteria. And the answer to the question here is essentially, what are the most important considerations or criteria when enterprises do open source intake? So the way that this was asked was that a number of different criteria was presented, and the respondents would score the importance of each. And on the right here, you can see the percentage of respondents who ranked a certain criteria as either important or as very important or critical. So if we start with the top two, grouping those together, those basically cover everything related to handling known vulnerabilities, exploits, other types of issues, as well as security practices in the project or community itself. So a security practice could, for example, be the process-related things like code reviewing or specific tooling being used. Or it could be based on metrics, such as how quickly security issues remain before fixes are merged to the project. Next up, we have compliance with open source policy, which means how does a project or specific component comply with any written rules that a company has related to using open source? I'll talk a bit more about open source policy in a bit, but generally, if you don't know what this is a more or less formal document that companies maintain that has any kind of rules related to open source in that business. The next criteria was functional needs, not very complicated. What does the software do? What problems does it solve? How does it fit us technically? How does it perform, etc. Next up is internal competency, which is our company's technical know-how in this particular technology or with this particular programming language or environment. Next up, open source license compliance specifically, which is a slight overlap with the policy, but it answers questions such as, can we comply with the license obligations, and are the license risks acceptable? And finally, health and popularity, where an example of health could be something like the number of active contributors to a project, and popularity could be something such as the number of forks or stars a product has on GitHub. And these overlap a bit. And the basic question answered by both of this is generally whether the project will remain as actively maintained in the future, or if there's even a risk that it will be abandoned. So these are the most important criteria. Now we know what the criteria is or are, and we know what enterprises primarily are concerned with when choosing open source. So let's have a look at the cost or impact of investigating projects for selection according to those criteria. And we will focus on the top activities that were discovered to have, according to the study, a very large or a large negative impact. So you can see that 60%, the top one, is learning and exploring new components. And here the problem is, how do you find and use basic metrics or insights about a project or component? Next up at 58% is understanding or researching license compliance rules about a component. And this also covers things like, what is an open source license? What licenses apply here? What do I need to do as a developer? Am I even allowed to use this? The next item on the list of negative impacting stuff is waiting for approval. And this is covers understanding the open source intake process, gathering information you need in order to fire off the approval process, waiting for a response or corresponding with approvers. Second to last, we have working with non-optimal open source, and this is essentially any kind of consequence of making the incorrect choice, something you regret later. And finally, we have understanding and communicating open source policy. Essentially, if you're a developer, where is the open source policy? What does it say? What does it mean? What parts matter to me? And in the same way, if you're an OSPO or in a similar role, how can I communicate the open source policy effectively to the development teams? So now we will go into each of these areas in a bit more detail. So starting with issues around finding and using basic metrics or insights. A big problem here is that there usually is not a single pane of glass available. There's various tools and services available, and developers each have their own individual preferences, and those preferences are often based on personal opinion or based on habit. So unless your open source policy decides what the single source of truth is, any metrics or insights will be more or less random and impossible to compare. So let's have a look at an example. And let's say that the company intake policy requires any open source to be actively maintained by a healthy community in order to reduce the risk of ending up relying on unmaintained software. And we have one service on the left that appears to give the project in question a score of 10 out of 10 in maintenance, which sounds pretty good. looking at the same project through another service and examining the contributor statistics there, it appears as if the contributions have slowed down over time. And more interestingly, that it has one single contributor who is responsible for the vast majority of contributions in the past few years. And finally, yet another service for the same project claims that the community is active, but it has 0 contributors, which is a bit weird and confusing. So this can be quite arbitrary, and it should be no great surprise that finding metrics in data is kind of regarded as problematic. So moving on to the next problem. This is regarding understanding the license compliance rules. And open source licensing is inherently complicated and at least requires some level of expertise or understanding. Developing this understanding will take time and effort. And there's many tools that will help detecting license issues and non-compliance, but they are generally rely on scanning source code or at least manifest files in an SCA-like manner, which is after intake. And these tools still assume a level of understanding of both licensing and the intake policy itself. So another thing companies do is that they try to solve this with yearly education, which in itself is helpful, but it doesn't really speed up the intake process that much, as this type of yearly education tends to focus more on general knowledge and doesn't go into the detail level of depth required to do the complete review or analysis of licensing situations. So as a result of this, many companies will still need to have a legal team or an open source board review components during intake. When it comes to intake tooling, this quite often means not so much more than creating a JIRA ticket. Finally, the company open source policy tends to be the source of truth that developers are referred to. And I will talk a bit more about that shortly. Next problem was waiting for approval, which is essentially another way of saying slow and ineffective processes and tools. On the top there, you can see an example of what a manual approval process might look like, where the developer wants to use a piece of open source, researches it, finds a component they want to use, hands that off to an engineering manager or tech lead for a technical review to make sure that this is actually sound. We shouldn't write this code ourselves. It solves the problem we wanted to solve and so on. Once that is out of the way, it goes off to a legal review to make sure that the licensing situation is okay. We have control of linkage rules, how we will distribute it, how we will handle any kind of artifact we need to provide in order to comply with the license rules and so on. And once that is done, it's time for the security review where any known vulnerabilities are checked. The community security practices might be reviewed and so on. And finally, when all this is done, you can do the intake, and then you can start scanning the software with your SCA tooling regularly, and you can release it. Some other points here is that this process is often completely manual, and it's sometimes manual to the point of filling out a PDF form and emailing that form back and forth. And what automation exists is generally it's very little. It's something like create the JIRA ticket and something around that, even in companies that consider themselves as not relying on manual processes. Another issue here is that the very same process is often used for all open source intake, where you make no difference between, let's say, a utility that you use in unproduction versus a complex framework that your business critical logic will be built on. And I mean, in that case, if you are doing a business critical decision, having a month-long or 4-month-long intake process sounds like a good idea. Fine, let's make sure to make the right choice. But it's not as fine for a developer to have to wait for weeks or even months to be allowed to use a simple component. So these slow and manual processes significantly raise the bar for using open source. And while open source might be formally acceptable in reality, it might not be used at all, or at least very little as a result of this. So yes, let's move on to the next slide then. Yeah, so not saying that we should remove intake processes. They definitely serve a purpose, but we are saying that they sometimes, or at least often in their current shape or form, stand in the way of businesses taking advantage of the wealth of open source available. Moving on to the next area of negative impact, which is working with non-optimal open source. Over half of the respondents said that they see a large negative impact from the direct consequences of making incorrect choices during intake, where those choices are made due to not having the time and or opportunity to properly research the existing components and according to policy viable components. So this results in having to maintain components with a community that's no longer active or that is no longer as active as expected, or even where the component has passed its end of life date. It results in not directly having to maintain the component, but perhaps having to create workarounds for something that's no longer being updated. And it results in having to replace components as the lesser of two evils due to an inactive community or due to a license change, which happens fairly frequently, or too late discovering that the community is no longer as responsive or active as originally assumed. So finally, on the next slide. Understanding and communicating policy. Open source policies can be vastly different. One company A could have an 80-page coverage policy that covers their general open source business strategy, how to engage with communities, how to do open source contributions, large sections on patent and copyright, open source license for intake, of course, open source license selection for in-house developed open source, security standards, and so on and so on and so on. While another company might have a 1 or 2 page policy that basically says, please comply with any open source licenses and also avoid AGPL because that's problematic for us. The problems here are basically navigating and understanding the open source policy. Like I mentioned before, where can I find the policy? What does it mean? Am I following it right now? And similarly, communicating the open source policies. If you are in the OSPO, like how can I make sure that developers find and understand it? And the respondent data in the survey said that 33% of respondents have to spend more than 4 hours every week trying just to navigate and understand the company open source policy. So now we have explored the most important selection criteria, and we have also gone through the challenges that meeting those criteria present. So let's move on and see how this all works out in the end.
All right. And let's move on here then. All right. No, so we've explored the different areas, and then we checked. Okay, so where do companies find non-compliance to open source policy during their latest open source intake? And 27% say that they find it during the intake / selection process. This is good. This is where you want to find things, even though all of these manual processes might slow it down and it might be not very cost efficient. It is found early. 41% of respondents said that they found it a bit late. And they found it during an SCA scanning, during manual review. This means that they've already implemented, they've already brought in the code, they have selected it, they've started scanning it, and then they realize, oh no, we actually can't use this or have to work around something. So that is too late, because already then it's additional costs, it's additional developer hours put onto this problem that could have been caught earlier. 28% of respondents found it during code review or testing, and that's way too far. Then it's missed all the extra steps. Maybe they don't even have an SEA tool at all, and yeah, that's just very expensive and very time consuming. And 4% responded that they found it close to release. This means that they haven't found it until the very, very last moment, and they're gonna have to redo or rethink everything up till that point. So there is no reason that the 27% figure, the 27% that did it right, shouldn't be 100% or close to it. The information exists out there to make good decisions at intake. And the longer time it takes to find the non-compliance, the more expensive it is to fix. But with the right tools and with the right structure, you should be able to catch pretty much everything early on. So moving on, we have a poll question. So you should be seeing a poll pop up on your screens right now. And it's just, does your company require manual approval to use open source? So are there any manual processes? To use open source at your company? So yes, there is, or no, completely automatic, or you don't know. So just take a few seconds to think about that and answer it, and we'll go through if you recognize yourself in the survey as well. Would be very interesting to see. All right, I think we can start wrapping up the questions here now. So yeah, a vast majority of people here today work in a company or that requires manual approval to use open source. So these 60%, you're part of the people that might be able to find things early on, but it's slow. The processes could be slow, and it's the processes are taking too much time and too expensive. There's also 20% that said no to manual approval in their company, which then begs the question: is it automatic, or are there no processes there at all for manual approval? But we'll move on. But it's very interesting. Thank you for participating in the poll. So we asked, based on all of this, what are the negative consequences due to open source challenges that you face? And the most common one is wasted time fixing poor code. So that's having to replace components, maintain otherwise unmaintained libraries, just like we talked about earlier. And then 44% of respondents said higher costs for development, and that kind of goes into the previous point as well. With replacing components, takes time, needs to put more staff, and yeah, increases costs. Developer frustration. This can introduce a lot of frustration for developers, not feeling efficient, feeling like there's red tape in the way of them actually doing their job, and feeling like they work in archaic manners and not modern. Then we have longer development cycles, which also ties into the previous points. There's uncertainty, there's complex problems that needs to be solved later. Things pop up late in the development cycle that needs to be addressed, and this could have been avoided if it was caught earlier. Then we have more technical debt, the increase of technical debt, because projects get unmaintained and suddenly you are depending on a few components that are not maintained, that you have to do workarounds for, that you have to replace, etc. So adding to the technical debt there. And then poor quality code, more fixes, hacks, last minute shortcuts to get past these technical debt problems and things introduced. Interesting to note here is that only 3% of respondents said that they have not experienced negative consequences. So that means 97% of everyone responding to the survey has seen negative consequences due to open source code challenges. So moving on to the next one. We want to just highlight this, that a large majority of companies say automating the intake would have a large or transformational benefit to the organization. Going back to the previous slides that we had, it's very clear that there are a lot of interest and a lot of willingness to adapt to an automatic intake process, to not have to rely on these manual processes that are very much not fault-free and that hinder developers in a lot of ways. So then what are the benefits of automation, and what are the expected benefits of the people responding in the survey? So this will show people that have answered that this would have a transformational benefit or a large benefit to these specific points. So 70% answered a higher level of security, software security. So reducing the risk of introducing software with high security risk. And this was also one of your main points that you brought up in the first poll question, vulnerabilities, open source vulnerabilities, being able to catch that earlier on. Increased developer productivity, easier to take advantage of the wealth of open source for developers, not being blocked with the manual approval processes, etc. Faster time to market of new products and services, less time needed to correct the mistakes that were found late. Also ties into the whole finding things early part. Reduce development costs, and that is more use of open source, fewer developer hours spent on correcting intake errors, and you don't have to make custom components internally. You can use already existing libraries and be way more efficient that way. Then we have 71% that answered less wasted time managing open source dependencies, selecting, maintaining, utilizing, and we can include researching here as well. Instead you have this single pane of glass to make the right decisions. And we also talked about that with now we have different ways to try to figure out if a project is good enough, but you can't really compare any of the ways. So it's just down to people having discussions and what they prefer. And then reducing developer frustration. So once again, less red tape, quicker decisions, easier to use open source, less technical debt, fewer components that will need replacement at some point, healthier open source. And then we have, lastly there at 64%, less time spent replacing open source dependencies. So fewer components actually needing to be replaced completely. So then onto the next slide here. Also going into the key capabilities for automated intake and the expected benefits of that. And 77% of survey respondents said that it would be a transformational large benefit with automated security policy check during intake and selection. And we believe that an intake tool should check an intake candidate against company security policy. That should be done at intake. Then automated approval workflow. An intake tool should automatically approve, assign approvers, communicate decisions and information, etc. During open source intake. And then at 70% again, we have automated health check. An intake tool should check an intake candidate against company project health policy. And also license checking. It should also check against company license policy automatically at intake. And lastly, it needs to be developer focused and communicate that. An intake tool should ensure that the communication around policies focuses on the developer. It shouldn't be hidden away. It should be In broad view, it should be in the tool that developers use, so they can see live as they're doing their intake, will this pass or will it not? And I want to finish off here with a quote here from the survey, and that is, automation can be applied in multiple different ways during discovery and intake. Respondents expected the most impact to come from automating the security policy check during intake, but more than 2/3 expected the same from automating checks on license and health policies. So it's almost equally as important. Together, reducing the time it takes to complete these tasks and getting better at identifying non-compliant projects mean that improvement will accrue long-term benefits well into the future. So with that, I'm going to hand over the last part to Måns again. Yeah.
Thank you. So we were approaching the end here, but let's briefly discuss how these capabilities could work in practice. So to start with, you have to allow creating policies for your security practices, for community health, and for open source licenses. Or actually anything that's dictated in your open source intake policy. So it's important to remember that this is not simply about matching known vulnerabilities to specific components or anything of the sort. So, and it also has to be possible to quickly and easily check whether any given project or component is compliant or not with your company policy. Because you don't want to wait for software composition analysis tooling, and you definitely want to make sure that your developers can and will use this. So as Tim mentioned in the first minute of the presentation, we are developing a tool and a service called the Bricked Open Source Select that will help you with exactly this, allowing you to create the representation of your company intake policy. And your developers will then be able to examine any given open source project or package that they find in the wild through the lens of your open source policy and getting immediate indications of any potential issues. So no need for scanning, no need to understand the complexities of licensing, no arbitrary Googling for metrics. Next slide, Tim, please. And finally, the points about developer-focused communication. In the roadmap for this tooling, we will also support things like automatic approval or rejection as soon as you try to trigger the intake process, if that can be determined. And if it turns out that review is in fact needed by other people, then all and any relevant information that we can gather will be automatically provided. So there's no need for the manual correspondence back and forth, or an ask for the developers to provide this information. And finally, we will make the open source policy easily accessible through the same tool that will be used for discovery and intake. So no need to dive through these potentially 80-page document lost on SharePoint somewhere to find out what the actual rules are. And with that, it's time for the final poll, I think.
Yes, you should have all gotten a poll coming up right now. So
All right, I'll finish up. So to conclude the study, it found that open source challenges pose a significant risk for companies, and that enterprises recognize that selecting compliant libraries is critical to the business. And it found that manual processes are inefficient and that they often happen late in the development life cycle. Like we saw, 73% of the time, in compliance was discovered during development, testing, or close to the release. And finally, we found that automated selection and intake provides immense benefits to companies: time saving, cost reduction, productivity increase. And finally, thank you for attending. Please make sure that your company uses the right tools, automate as much as possible, as early as possible, and use a sensible intake process that considers the developers. Thank you very much. Now it's time for Q&A.
I'm gonna check here. All right, so we have some questions here that are, and feel free to add more questions into the Q&A if you have any questions or thoughts or anything. But we'll start from top to bottom. Will the recording be shared via email? I think so, yeah. Maybe someone else knows that better than me, but I would assume so, yes.
I can confirm that it will be shared via email after.
Yeah. And does OpenText offer this solution on-prem? Måns, that's a question for you.
We don't currently offer it on-prem. It's SaaS and cloud hosted.
Another question here is, how is this solution priced?
Currently, the pricing is depending on the number of users, and it's a few dollars per users.
I think it's.
I don't know exactly how, but it's a fairly low price, but it's per depending on the number of active users you have.
And then we have another question here. What specifying, like in the last poll question here, so what is it we would demo in a demo for the product?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in that case, we would demo how to set up policies, examples of that, how that can be done, and how a developer would view open source in the wild through those policies. For example, you would look at a dependency through in the browser, looking at the package registry, and you would see different colors indicating what kind of rules in the policy that are that these packages meets or that it doesn't meet. So that's what we would demo right now.
And to add there is that we will probably also then demo the web browser extension for this. So a developer can go to any package manager repository, so like NPM or GitHub or things like that, and go to a component, and they would be able to get this data right there, so they don't have to use a select UI that they're not used to or a workflow they're not used to. We meet them where they find their open source too. So it's a good thing to add there.
Yeah, that's a good addition. We would also demonstrate more details around how we look at community health. So details around that. That's a very important topic as well.
Right, and then we have another question here. Do you also have IDE integration plugins?
That is on the roadmap and something we're working on during this year. We wouldn't demo it right now, but going forward, yes. But and it's the same kind of reasoning. The IDE is as close to the developer as you can get, and getting this kind of policy lens in the IDE is of course the ultimate goal.
All right. Anyone got any final questions? Get them in now, because I don't see anything there right this moment.
can't believe we hit the time target to a minute. That's incredible, if I may say so.
Pretty spot on.
Yeah.
No, I don't think any more questions are popping in here. So if nothing else, then I will say goodbye from my side, and thank you all for listening to us talk here, and hope you found it interesting and educational, and that we'll see you in the future.
Thank you so
Thank you very
much, Tim and Mons. Yeah, I really appreciate it. Appreciate it to the team at OpenText as well. We want to thank everyone for attending, and we hope you enjoyed it as much as we did today. There's a lot of great information throughout this entire slide presentation. If anybody has any questions for us, you can always reach us at webinars@vib.tech. But if not, I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their Wednesday. Take care, everyone.
Take care.